Hello. Can you hear me, Christian? Just checking.
Yes, I can. Hi.
Perfect. Great. All right. So I think we might have started the timer a little bit too late. So because we just have 30 minutes, let's get going. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are in the world. I'm really happy to welcome you for this webinar today. How to support kids with dyslexia. So my name is Pierre. I'm currently a school advisor here at Constructor. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce Christian, the speaker. So the webinar is going to last for about 30 minutes. We're going to try to finish on time. We're also going to try to have about 5 minutes at the end for your question. I think you can type your question on the side chat. I never know which side it is, so probably this way. If we can't address them live, we'll make sure to get back to you by email or through YouTube. Also, the webinar is being recorded. We're going to be sending the recording by end of day tomorrow. So if you have to step out, you'll have the recording in your inbox tomorrow. You may also want to stay until the end of the session. We're going to be sharing a coupon code so that you can apply to our mass learning program called Calcularis. So now on to the speaker. So the speaker today is Christian Vogeli. Christian is a computer scientist. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just said hi. I just said hi.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I was in the flow. Christian, so he's a computer scientist by training who's been working in the disability space for over 15 years. And I think now we may be approaching 20 years, Christian.
Yes.
Christian worked, he worked on his first neuroscience-backed prototype in 2006. And it was autographed to really help kids with dyslexia learn how to read. Then in 2011, Christian and the team launched Calcularis, a learning program to help kids with dyscalculia learn the foundational skills in math. And over the past 15 plus years, thousands of teachers, parents, hundreds of thousands of students around the world have been using the programs with hopefully a lot of success. So let me stop here. We don't have much time. So without further ado, Christian, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining this webinar today, where I try to cover a couple of basics around dyscalculia. In particular, what is dyscalculia? So I'll start with a couple of definitions, also examples and consequences for schools or at schools. And then I'll dive into what may cause dyscalculia and what development models, also neuroscientific models, can or could explain dyscalculia. And then I'll finish with a couple of things, what to do and what to avoid based on these neurological development models that can explain dyscalculia. So, there are several ways to call dyscalculia, several names that it got over the years, from learning difficulty in math to learning disability in math. Also, people sometimes calling it dyslexia in math because it's kind of similar to dyslexia, but with respect to math, kind of similar in terms of if somebody has dyscalculia, reading, writing, languages, history, whatever, might be no problem at all for the child, but math is a difficulty. So that's the similarity to dyslexia, or one of the similarities to dyslexia, that it's affecting one domain like math, whereas other domains might not be affected by the difficulty. It also is called mathematical learning disorder, and they also put down for you the actual definition that currently Wikipedia is offering, that it's a disability that results in difficulty learning or comprehending arithmetic and difficulty in understanding numbers. This dyscalculia affects about 6% of the population. If you look at it as those children or also adults or young adults who perform 2 standard deviations below the average in math. So really have a big impairment in math. There's also a second group that you might call struggling in math, or where you would call it or might call it like math weakness, where the difficulties are not as strong. The difficulties, or these children might be underperforming maybe 1 standard deviation in math, but you would still look at the child and say, well, looking at the general intelligence of the child, looking at how he performs otherwise, I'm still a little bit surprised how many struggles there are in math. And then that's typically affecting about 20% of children who fall in this category. So what do you observe actually when you have kids with such difficulties, or also adults? The very first example I put down here is actually from a sociology professor that I met a couple of years ago. And she told me, at the age of 50, for her, with Dyscalculia, it's still not clear that if something costs 1990, if the $20 bill is enough to pay. Because here in 1990, it's 4 numbers. There's only 2 numbers on the bill. There are niners in here that she knows are larger than 2, but it's not clear to her immediately that 1990 is smaller than 20. Typical are also swappers. This could be 64 or 46, and also very typical error patterns in performing arithmetic tasks. For example, 13 plus 15 is 10 if you just sum up the digits, or 13 plus 15 might result, you might write down 46 because you kind of know, okay, it's an addition, there's something special in addition, the tens crossing, right? So you also do something special when you solve this task yourself. So maybe you do what we call inner and outer addition. You just add the outer digits and the inner digits, and that's how you get to 46 as a result of 13 plus 15. Or also a classical is that 33 minus 26 is 11, because you look at these calculation and you realize that you cannot deduct 3 minus 6. That's not possible, right? But what you can do is you can do 7 minus 6, so that's 1. And you can also do 3 minus 2, so that's also 1. So the result is 11. So a whole set of patterns which actually show that you have some algorithms at the back of your head, but you have no understanding of how big the numbers are and if the results you get are possible or likely in any way. Now, one could say that dyscalculia only affects math, but there are several papers showing that people with dyscalculia, for example, also earn less and spend less money during their lifetimes. They fall ill more often, and they are more often in conflict with the law. Also, they need more support and help at school. So on the one hand, dyscalculia is actually a socioeconomical problem also, but it's also that there's a lot of psychological strain on the kids and also their families sometimes, because these bad prospects are looming, and it's a strain for them to overcome these difficulties so they don't fall into these patterns that too often affect people with dyscalculia. Unfortunately, it's quite challenging for schools to deal with dyscalculia because there's hardly any efficient material available. And also there's really little time of professionals usually to support those children, if there are professionals available at all, or at least professionals taught in dyscalculia intervention. Because I just read again at the end of September a paper published by the US government that there's a teacher shortage of qualified teachers, and teachers just, sometimes don't have the qualification to support kids, and that makes it difficult for the schools to support children with dyscalculia. And also, there's hardly any means to train independently, autonomously. So really, intervention very often requires one-to-one situations, one-to-one instructions, which are hard to provide with limited time and the teacher shortage. That's particularly a problem because practice makes permanent in math. Math skills are automated. It's not enough to just know the concepts of math. You have to automate a lot of math, and I'll make an example on the next slide. Like a piano player, a piano artist, it's not enough to know that there's a C key and the D key and an E key, etc. And not enough to know the black keys and the white keys. You actually have to practice, and you have to move semi-consciously over the board, over the keys on a piano. And you also have to have this automation when you want to do math. But this requires regular training, this automation, and that's hard to organize. So to put it mildly, very often children make less progress than everybody would hope for. I told you I'll make a couple of examples of the automation of math skills. And the first example is if I ask you which amount has more circles, the one on the left or the one on the right. I guess most of you in this webinar will immediately know that on the right-hand side, there are more circles, right? It's actually 24 and 57 circles. But if I ask you, how does your brain solve this problem? How does your brain determine that there are more circles on the right-hand side? Who can answer this? Who knows how the brain solves this problem? I assume almost nobody knows how the brain does this, right? It's automated by the brain to solve tasks like this. Also, if I ask you what's 7 plus 5, what's 7 plus 5? I think everybody knows it's 12. But you don't do 7 plus 3 is 10, 5 minus 3 is 2, 10 plus 2 is 12, so 12 is the result. You just know by heart. You learned this as a math fact, you save this as a fact. If I ask you what's 11 times 10, 11 times 10, I assume that most of you, as soon as I say 11, see a 1, 1. So if I provide a number word, I say 11, you immediately convert it to an Arabic representation as 1, 1. And when I say times 10, I assume most of you visually add the 0 to the 11 you just imagined. And that's how you get to 110. So I present the task verbally. You immediately convert it to an Arabic visual representation, and then you add or solve the task visually for you by adding the 0. So besides automating these different arithmetic functions, you also automate switching between the different representation of numbers. So again, I said 11, right? There's immediately for you some kind of feeling that 11 is this quantity of stars. You immediately know that 11 can be depicted as 1, 1 in digits. And you also have an immediate understanding that 11 is slightly larger than 10, but smaller than 20. So you also, as experienced math doers, immediately know how to place this 11 on the number range, on the number line, how to relate it to other numbers. The first time or the first model that explained this equivalency of the number representations and how also the brain can handle them or stores them was provided or described by Dehaney roughly 30 years ago in his so-called triple code model. And he described that numbers can be presented auditorily or verbally. They can be represented as analog magnitudes, and they can be represented in a visual Arabic number form. And different brain areas automate these three different models. And besides automating the representations, these brain areas also support other functions, like, for example, the auditory verbal area also supports remembering arithmetic facts, like the 7 plus 5 I made before, I made as an example before, is stored in the same area that processes the verbal numbers. This brain area that performs analog magnitude recognition also supports comparison and estimation, and the visual Arabic number form, or the module that processes visual Arabic number form, also allows you to calculate exactly and, for example, define even and uneven. That was first described by Dehaney 30 years ago, and his model was later defined, for example, by von Aster and Shalev in 2007. And they figured out or explained how these different representations are automated over time by the brain. What we are most likely born with is the core competence of understanding magnitudes. Already 3-week or 3-month-old babies can distinguish smaller and larger amounts. They can also distinguish, for example, 2 teddy bears and 5 teddy bears, right? So we're probably or very likely born with this core competence of telling amounts apart. Then in preschool, we learn the verbal representation. We learn to call 2 dots 2 and 5, 5. And in school, we later learn how to write 2 and 5 as numbers. We learn how to write 17. We learn how to write 1,000, etc. And the last representation that we learn and that our brain automates is the mental number line. These different representations are automated in different brain regions, in parietal regions. Here in this orange color, we automate the number words. In the left, in the visual cortex, we automate the Arabic numbers, and in occipital areas, we automate first the system of magnitude and then the mental number line. This development happens and can be easily or can be traced with fMRI studies. And what you typically see, this is a child and an adult doing math, doing actually the same math task, is you can see that the child at the beginning of doing math has a lot of frontal brain activity. So you have the children or a child that has to concentrate. That's the left hemisphere of the brain. That's the brain from the top. That's the right hemisphere. You have the child that requires a lot of frontal brain activity to understand the task and to perform the task. The frontal brain areas are those areas that you could call multi-purpose areas that can address new tasks, they can do logical thinking, they can do inference, etc. And these are the ones we use for everything we address at beginning, for everything we do new. But over time, our brain automates the things we ask it to do a lot. And this is an adult brain who performs the same math task as the child brain here on the left, but has these specialized brain areas that I just explained on the last slide, with this brain area here automating number line, and this brain area back here automating the Arabic and visual representation of the numbers. And this automation of tasks, also called the functional specializations, leads to the tasks requiring less effort and being solved more quickly. This process, this so-called frontoparietal shift of activities from frontal brain areas to parietal areas, is part of the brain's plasticity. It happens to everything that we ask our brain to do. Also, the piano player I mentioned before will first play the piano with a lot of frontal activity, and the better or the more he practices, the more parietal areas will guide his hands over the keys. So this happens with everything. It happens with driving a car. Anything we do on a daily basis will be automated by the brain in this manner. This requires hundreds, if not thousands, of repetitions. And what I also want to make as a remark is it's not the same as learning something by heart or memorizing. It's really the brain specializing brain areas on performing tasks that we ask it to do regularly. Again, more schematically, you have the brain of an untrained math performer that uses a lot of brain capacity in the front. And then with training, with practice, we have this mainly 3 brain areas that afterwards automate number words, cardinality number line, and the Arabic numerals. Now, unfortunately, in people with dyscalculia, this specialization of the brain areas at the back is delayed. And it is delayed up to 6 years. Now, you might say 6 years is not so terrible, but if you actually think of a 15-year-old who might get as much automation and support from his brain to do math as a 9-year-old, then a 15-year-old and a 9-year-old, that's really quite dramatic for a 15-year-old to not have more support than maybe a 3rd grader. So on the one hand, these brain areas don't develop as quickly as with people without these difficulties, and also the connection between these brain areas is weaker. So they also have more difficulties to transcode, to go, for example, from me saying 11 to seeing the 1-1 is way more difficult for people with dyscalculia. The reason for this delay in automation, functional specialization, is most likely anxiety. Anxiety in general is a blocker of learning. And in children with dyscalculia, this seems to be the main reason why they do not specialize these brain areas. In particular, it has been found that the amygdala, which is a brain area that controls anxiety, is a lot larger than in dyscalculics, than in the general population, which really means that they're afraid of doing math. And this anxiety, this being afraid of, can block all these automation processes. So that's the problem. These brain areas are delayed in automation, and in some cases might never actually automate. So from all of this, which I presented so far, what should you do? What should you not do? From this observation that anxiety and fear might be the cause of dyscalculia, it's really important that you determine the level of math anxiety if you start working with a child. You have to be aware that this anxiety, this being afraid of, might actually be the cause. And then try to avoid moments and situations where this anxiety is showing or where these children feel anxiety. And if necessary, you really also have to address this anxiety, specifically work on emotions, restore the self-confidence of the children to work on maths without anxiety. What you also have to be aware of if you start working with a child, in particular maybe in fourth grade, is that with enough frontal capacity and with enough frontal capabilities, also a child that does not automate can be quite capable of performing math tasks on a very good and very high level, maybe up till third or fourth grade. And if you look at the child in fourth grade, he might do quite well up to third grade or even fourth grade tasks just with frontal brain activity without having a specialization of the parietal areas. But the actual cause, even though the child only starts struggling in fourth grade, the actual cause might be a missing automation of skills that were practiced or should have been practiced or should have been automated in earlier years. So it's really important to be aware of the fact that the problems might occur later or might be observable later than they actually occurred, because you can compensate for some of this missing automation by just focusing more and using more frontal capabilities. Third, automation requires practice. You have to be able to organize short but regular units. Short units because the brain tires after like 15 to 20 minutes. All these automation processes, they stop working after 15 to 20 minutes of concentration. So you have to do short units, but they have to be regular, because only if the brain realizes the importance of math, the importance of the task you ask it to do, will it automate. Finally, you should be aware that multiple languages in upbringing can increase the confusion and can make it harder for a child to master and automate the number words. And in general, children with a bilingual or trilingual background have a slightly higher tendency of being dyscalculic, because it's harder to automate the number words. So as a consequence, if you start working with a child, try to determine possible other languages than English or Spanish that they've worked with, and consider training number words in different languages, because that's just the reality for them, that they work in different languages in every day. And last but not least, the last representation that the brain automates, as I explained in this four-step model, is the number line. And presumably, the brain automates or whatever is most important for it the last. So presumably, the number representation, the number line, the mental number line, is the most important representation of math and numbers for the brain. And you should really practice on the number line with the children, because this is what the brain supposedly profits most from. Let me wrap up by quickly mentioning, because we are also introduced, that I have been working on applications for children with learning difficulties for the last almost 20 years. What we considered of these best practices in our own approach, Calcularis, the math application that we offer for children with dyscalculia. To handle the anxiety and the fear, which might be the cause of dyscalculia, Our applications use artificial intelligence to automatically adapt to each child so that the content we ask, the tasks we pose are not too difficult, but also not too easy. So we don't overwhelm the kids and they're not afraid of the difficult tasks they might encounter in Calcularis. Also, just very generally, working with a device is removing social pressure. Also, to counteract this tendency that you generally might overestimate the skills of a child and that you might miss that they've just failed to automate basic skills or previous skills, we have all children starting in number range 0 to 10 to really make sure that we cover also these basic skills that you might overlook otherwise. And then if a child has difficulties, we'll advance it more quickly than those. If a child has no difficulties and really masters those skills, we advance it more quickly than if a child that has problems. Also, to offer enough practice time, because automation requires practice time, Calcularis allows autonomous learning so that children can work anytime, at home, at school, whatever. Whenever it's possible to fit in 15 minutes of practice, you can use the application and train without the teacher or educator instructing you. And finally, because the number line seems to be so important for the brain, we really use the number line in almost every task that's where it's useful. And also, for example, show addition and subtractions or arithmetic operations on the number line to allow the brain to navigate forth and back and making the numbers larger and smaller. If you want to learn more about Calcularis, I put down a QR code here that will take you to the landing page of this application. Well, to wrap it up, for me, it's really important that you give every child a solid foundation. As this four-step model describes by Shalev and von Oster, you really have to climb all the individual steps of these representations. You have to automate all of them. Otherwise, if you have gaps anywhere in these basic math facts, you will never become a proficient math doer. So the goal has to be to enable each learner to acquire these basic math skills. And that will require that they can practice at their own speed and without anxiety. And most likely, that's only possible if you organize an independent and autonomous training for them. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Christian. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We still have 2 minutes. And I'm just seeing a couple of questions that just came in our way. Sure. First question. So, Christian, can you share any ideas to make my interventions more effective when dealing with kids with dyscalculia?
Right. I mean, I would really go back to the slide maybe here, where I would say one of the most important things is that you frame it in a way that you have a fearless, anxiety-less environment. This is really an important factor. And the second most important factor is that you consider that the automation requires practice and that you better do similar things or even maybe the same things over and over again, even if that might be boring, but that you repeat same things, same representations, same additional, possibly multisensorial material, so that the brain really realizes that it's something worth automating. So these two: reduce anxiety, practice consistently and frequently.
Okay, perfect. Another question, and you'll have 1 minute to answer. What is the and it's a pretty small question, I think. What is the relationship between dyslexia and dyscalculia? Do you usually have both? Can you just have one? Can you please expand on that?
Right. There is indeed an overlap between dyscalculia and dyslexia. Roughly 1/3 of all people with dyslexia also have dyscalculia. It depends on the study you read, but roughly 1/3 is a good estimation of all the studies summarized. And on average, as I explained at the beginning, only about 6% of the population have dyscalculia. Now, if amongst dyslexic, the likelihood is almost 30% or around 1/3. This shows statistically that there has to be a link between dyscalculia and dyslexia, really significant link. So yes, you're more likely to have dyscalculia if you already have dyslexia.
Okay, perfect. And I see 4:30 on my side. Do we have a second next slide just to close it off?
Yeah, we have your
perfect.
final words.
Perfect. And I'm just going to close it here, folks. So if you have any questions, comments, feedback as well, we love feedback on maybe what we could improve. Or if you also need help with the QR code, just contact me. My email address is there. Thank you very much for attending. As mentioned earlier, we're going to be sending out the recording tomorrow. So have a good evening, everyone, and goodbye.
Yeah, and if you want to get that 1-year subscription of Calcularis at the rebate, then that's the QR code on this slide that you should use for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting me, Pierre.
Always a pleasure, Christian. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.